Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be the one to kick off today's event. It's an event that I'm been really excited about for a while now. And thank you so much for choosing to spend your morning with us. I'm Carrie Foley, and I manage the course design team at the Division of Continuing Education. Um, and my role here today is going to mostly just be passing it off to people, which is the role that I love the best. But before I go and do that, I wanted to give a quick introduction to the panel, and also just start by saying how completely impressed I am with all of the stories that I've been hearing around the university, just about the gargantuan efforts that everyone has been making to make community an important part of their remote courses, especially considering we were thrust into this, obviously so last minute. Speaking of last minute, I remember back in the spring when we were originally having these conversations and we learned about that, we learned that we were going to be going online for the fall. I was a little bit worried about this exact topic. And the reason is that, in March when we moved online, we all sort of had a community. Everyone in the residential courses knew each other. And so that natural community building that happened. I know from my own personal experience designing online courses for the Division of Continuing Education that it's really hard to build community in online courses, and it's really important to build community in online courses. And probably most importantly, community building looks different in online courses than it does in residential courses. So it takes a lot of effort, dedication, thoughtfulness, and prioritization. And so I knew that without strong community in these courses this fall, our students and us as faculty and staff would be just at a complete loss. And especially considering this fall, we knew that we were in the midst of a global pandemic, but also, experiencing a lot of insecurity around racial injustice and around the upcoming divisive election cycle, and just so much that's going on in the States, but also across the world. And so I felt like, oh my goodness, what if we don't have strong community and we're all going through this in isolation? And so it really made me nervous. So I was so excited to see that so many of us didn't fall victim to that, and we really prioritized this. And so that's why I was really thrilled when Melissa asked my colleagues and I to host the session. So I'll stop there so I have time to introduce our wonderful faculty. First, I want to start off with my colleagues that helped plan this event. So the first would be Patrice Torsivia. Oh, I messed it up. She's the Associate Director of Learning Design at the HGSE Teaching and Learning Lab. And Patrice has been designing and teaching online courses for 15 years now. At Hugsy, she leads a team of learning designers, learning technologists, and media folks who support the design and development of the course How People Learn. And more recently, she led the effort in creating resources to support HGSE faculty in the transition to online. Rebecca Nesson is going to be moderating today's discussion. Rebecca currently serves as the Associate Dean of the Harvard College Curriculum, and she is the Associate Senior Lecturer in Computer Science at SEAS. Rebecca also teaches at Harvard Extension School and led the teaching and learning team at DCE for many years. And I can say with good authority, especially since she used to be my boss, that Extension School owes a great deal of gratitude to Rebecca for her leadership during her tenure at DCE. And I personally think much of why we were positioned to take on the pandemic so well was because of Rebecca's leadership. So thank you, Becca. And now our incredible faculty who are sharing experiences with us today. So Eddie Kohler is the Microsoft Professor of Computer Science and Area Chair for Computer Science at SEAS. This fall, they taught CS61, Systems Programming and Machine Organization. And their research interests include systems, networks, programming languages, and software engineering. So welcome, Eddie. Zoe Marks is a lecturer in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. She teaches 21st century global feminism and Africa and global politics. And her research and teaching interests focus on the intersection of politics and political violence, race, gender and inequality, peace building, and African politics. So welcome, Zoe. And Madhvi Venkatesh is a lecturer on biological chemistry and molecular pharmacology at the medical school. She is the Associate Director of Graduate Education for the Biological Chemistry and Molecular Pharmacology group. She also conducts research on student outcomes that result from educational innovations designed to promote graduate student skills, training, and wellness. So welcome, Madhvi. And last but by no means least, Christina V Villarreal is the faculty director for the Teacher Education Program at the Graduate School of Education, where she teaches an ethnic studies and education course. Her research explores enactments of humanizing pedagogies, racial literacy, and radical healing in secondary social studies classrooms through portraiture. During today's event, we'll have the privilege of hearing from each of these faculty members, and then we'll have time for a brief Q&A. And then my colleague Patrice will wrap up the discussion and leave us with some useful resources. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to Rebecca to set the stage for our panel discussion today.
Thank you, Kerry. So we're very lucky to have 4 faculty who leaned in to the challenge of building community in their courses, as I know many of you did in courses you were teaching or are planning to in courses you will teach, or supporting many courses that are planning to do that this spring. This was not an easy task to try to build community at this time and with the tools in front of us. Our faculty reported at the end of this a feeling of fatigue, and our students reported a feeling of fatigue with the experience of being online, with the overall overwhelmingness of the situation that we were all in, and also an appreciation of all of the flexibility that was made available to them. But at the same time, our students reported appreciation for all of the interactivity that was there in the classes. They engaged with the classes at an extremely high level and produced really good work, and also expressed feeling isolated, the need for the community that their courses were going to build. And at a time when there really wasn't a lot of other option for how to maintain that kind of community. The on-campus life just wasn't present at all. And all of this in the context of students spread around the globe and in widely varying situations in terms of their technology access and the other hardships that they were facing. So what the 4 faculty on our panel are going to do is just tell us a little bit about how they thought about building community in their class, what were the strategies that they tried, what were the things that worked, where were the surprises and things that went wrong, so that all of us can learn a little bit from their successes and from the lessons that the pitfalls have to teach us as we go forward into the spring semester. So with that, I'd like to ask Eddie to kick us off and tell us a little bit about what was, I think, highly engaged course experience in your course this fall.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I think I'll start by talking a little bit about what the course is. So CS61 is a relatively difficult, though, introductory course. So most of our computer science undergraduates, or a large fraction of them, take it here. It's also offered through DCE and has been offered through DCE for many years. So I was expecting around 140 college students and around 50 extension students. And we started out with about 160, 170 college students and a proportional number of DCE students. And so it's a course that is typically taught in lecture format with like a lot of office hours, where, students will sort of congregate in big groups in Maxwell Dworkin, which is the computer science building, for office hours. And it's typically a course that also has sections. So recreating the sort of community experience that people have in office hours was something that I was thinking about a lot, and as was my co-teacher, Minlan Yu. So I teach this course a lot. It's sort of, quote unquote, my course, but it was co-taught with another computer science faculty this past fall, so as to increase engagement. So before the semester started, there was, through the Learning Incubator at SEAS, a set of sort of introductions to different methods of teaching offered. And one that really struck me was this concept of team-based learning, where before the class started, people would be divided up into small groups of 4 to 6 students that would be consistent, where the students would be in that group from course meeting to course meeting, and where a lot of what went on during the course would be, answering questions. So there would be some, puzzler posed, And then the 4 people in the team would sort of collaborate with an answer, and then the whole class would get together and respond to that. And that seemed like a wonderful way, potentially, to start creating a persistent community. So we decided to divide students into small groups, which we called cohorts, of 4 students. And then what we were going to do is have those students attend our lecture sessions in a cohort, so that the cohort would be active listeners for around 1 lecture a week. And we decided also, in order to make the course available for people in the wide range of time zones, to have 4 course meetings a week that were shorter and at flexible times, rather than the usual 2 75-minute blocks. So that was the concept that we started with. And I would say that that concept, one thing that I would, as a piece of advice, is decide what success means. And maybe success means that 10% of your class actually works well with, actually get something out of the concept. So we instituted these cohorts. The cohorts were basically impossible to schedule because people had too many varying different conflicts and time conflicts. We created a set of cohorts. The students were like, I don't know what to do with these. And then we swiftly gave up on the cohort notion and sort of ironed down like exactly what we were going to do in terms of when the course was offered. So instead of scheduling on the fly, we had 4 fixed course meetings a week, Tuesday through Friday, for about an hour each time. But what we heard later was that the cohorts were actually quite successful for a minority of the class, where there were extension students and college students who were unfamiliar with other people in the class, who kept in contact with their cohort, even though it had only sort of existed in a required sense for about a week or 2. So I think in the end, that's probably a success, even though at the time it felt like a disaster. Having active listeners, which is where essentially the classes were all recorded, but students were expected to show up for around 1 a week. That ended up creating an interesting set of communities where there were some people who came to every lecture with their video on. There were some people who came to one particular lecture. And so there was sort of like a Tuesday night community and a Wednesday midday community and a Thursday morning community. That was successful, although I think probably for a bare majority of the class. We started off with trying to offer a bunch of different sort of office hour settings. Office hours were a major concern. There were some suggestions from nerds among our staff that we use a platform called Discord, which is typically used for video gaming, for students to communicate with one another. And we tried this, and at least as an old person, I found it chaotic and borderline offensive, and we ended up not using it. But what we did use, and I'll very briefly share my screen here, what we did use is a platform called Congregate, which was actually being built by some Harvard undergraduates, which has this metaphor of a set of tables that you can join with your video on and off. And so this URL, classcongregate.live, that URL was sort of up at all times. So, TFs were in this room at scheduled times. But what ended up happening by the end of the course was there were often students in the room, whether or not TFs were there. Some students helping each other out, some students sort of working quietly on their own. It's a much more free platform, free in the sense of when you're in Zoom, you feel like you are being managed. Even with recent updates, breakout room tends to be managed by the host. And in Congregate, people are just able to leave tables and rejoin other tables. That worked very well for us. And I think many students reported that they really appreciated the Congregate office hours community. So I think that was an extremely successful aspect of the class, and that's like it's a little bit of it's a tool that is still being developed, but we found the Congregate developers very responsive to us, and so I can't help but recommend it. In the end, I think a thing that made our class successful in terms of community is that it's a class that needs community. You need to take advantage of a community to get through the class. So this is an instance where the class is it's a high workload course, and because it's a high workload course, you have to engage with it. And I think that's I prefer for the course to be warm and welcoming and open, as well as high workload. But as a piece of advice, I guess, subtracting work from a course is likely to subtract community as well. The last thing I'll say is we had too many, it was too much for me. I think it was also a little bit much for the students. So I thought that offering 4 lectures at different times of the week, most of which I did, would be important for students who are in varying time zones all over the place. Some students felt like they had to watch all 4 hours of lecture a week, and that they had to watch it at 1-to-1 speed rather than 1.5-to-1 or 2-to-1. So some students really found that overwhelming. And by the end of the course, I felt pretty enervated. The course that I'm teaching in spring will have 2 lectures a week. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Eddie. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to move us along till we get to the Q&A. I will just say that what made me hound Eddie to get him on the panel was hearing from one of the students in his extension school course, who was a former teaching fellow of mine, about how important Congregate was to her experience and office hours, while I was hearing from so many other students that office hours in courses were one of the things that was really, really hard for them. So next we're going to go to Zoe to hear a little bit about her course.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people from whom I've learned so much about how to teach, and also new faces. My name is Zoe Marks. I'm on the faculty at the Kennedy School. And as Kerry mentioned at the outset, last semester I was teaching what's basically an elective large survey course called Africa and Global Politics. Most of my students are Kennedy School students, so they're master's students and mid-career master's students. And then there are always a sort of handful of students from all of the other Harvard schools, including Harvard College. So I had 70 students in the fall. And I think one of the things that is worth saying at the outset, just for context, is that my students have an incredibly wide range of knowledge coming into a course. And so some of my students have been high-level government officials or run their own businesses in African countries that they were raised in, and they've traveled widely throughout the region. And obviously other students are coming because they've never had an opportunity to study Africa or go to any African country. And so it's always a challenge in teaching this class to think about how to share space, how to ensure that those who come in acutely aware of their ignorance and sort of become more and more self-conscious, often in the first few weeks of the semester, how do they feel confident and comfortable to speak up and to ask the questions that help propel the conversation forward, while also uplifting the experiences and expertise of those who have kind of a lifetime of knowledge accumulation and observation and curiosity and still have unanswered questions. So I want to maybe before jumping into a couple of kind of planned comments, I'll try to keep an eye on the time. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that I saw in the chat so that I can kind of get it out of the way and not forget. First of all, Eddie, thank you so much for sharing the Congregate option. I'm definitely going to look into that. And I saw there was a conversation about video, and I thought that maybe because some of my students were in places where there was internet connectivity issues, and I had severe internet connectivity issues for the second half of the semester, despite being in the US, I just wanted to address Pinar's question. My approach to it, and something that I think has worked well in other meetings and forums that I've been in, is really to stress the value of seeing each other's faces and how much that means to me and how much that means to each other. While also one of the things I noticed is that when people had to switch their video off and just said that, that creates, I think, the sort of accountability and transparency that video on enables. And so one of the things I value about video is the sense of like, I know you're here. I know that you're listening or thinking or maybe getting a cup of tea or whatever. But maybe a middle ground is to suggest that if folks need to have their video off, they don't need to over disclose. They can just say, sorry, I can't have my video on today. It's great to see you all. Or need to turn off my video, I'm nursing. Or need to turn off my video, my child's having a temper tantrum, or I'm walking, or whatever. That's something that for me has really bridged that gap of feeling like when the video is off, there's a step back or anonymity is kind of filling the void. So I want to talk about my approach, some of the opportunities I've found for community building through this virtual format, some of the key challenges, and concrete examples of what I did. So I'll end there with just a sort of list of things. But I need to stress that when I got the invitation to participate, I hadn't finished submitting my grades. I felt like I wasn't sure if I did have success in community building. And I'm certainly not an expert like those of you who can be in this conversation and others in the room who've done a lot of online teaching. So I'm offering this as a sort of your mileage may vary, my mileage may vary. This is what I learned by doing. And my approach to community building, and this was organic rather than kind of coherent and strategic at the outset, but my approach to community building ultimately was something that I wove throughout the course. So I tried to create multiple touch points for one-on-one, small group, and collective community building. And I thought about, eventually I started to think about community building as something that every aspect of my teaching was either doing or not doing. And I think all of this was ultimately built on trust and rapport. And so if I have any advice at the outset, it's to really remember to build trust and rapport. I think in the fall, I felt like we were coming into a really fragile semester. I assumed students would be hostile and skeptical, and I was wrong. Our students were overwhelmingly willing to be there despite Zoom and enthusiastic to make the most of their time. And so the students really brought a lot more energy than I expected. I don't know if January is going to be the same. But either way, I was very explicit from the beginning about what kind of community I was trying to create. And I said, I want this to be an anti-racist, inclusive, and welcoming classroom for everyone. I want you to feel free to be curious and to grow in front of one another. And I want to support you in doing that. And I asked for their feedback. And honestly, no one said, here's what I think we should do to do that. But I think just offering that at the beginning when we did our community norms probably helped to set a tone of, okay, well, this is a safe space for me to kind of be an enthusiastic and curious participant. Some of the opportunities I've found with Zoom, I'm constantly trying to find the silver linings in spite of the circumstances. I found that students respond differently to technology-assisted connections. And so I think some students really come out of their shell on campus discussion boards, which I leaned on more heavily than I usually do, in terms of using the chat and even in the small breakout groups. And so you don't always know who's going to kind of respond well to what, but I think that variety of technology-assisted mediums is helpful for some students. I don't think it's kind of necessarily harmful for those that we assume it might be more difficult for. I also think that virtual classrooms can level the playing field. I think that in the grad school context, we have a lot of student cliques usually, especially in our Master's in Public Policy course, which is the largest and actually has sort of a built-in cohort system. And I think this can make students much more sort of status conscious and inhibited and socially aware. And I think being in Zoom together sort of encouraged people to connect with the person who showed up in Zoom rather than this idea of a person who existed in a broader social network. I also think that seeing people's faces was really positive. Often my students see the side of somebody's face or the back of their head for most of the semester. And so I think this is part of what the technology does that can help to create intimacy or lend a personal touch where it feels like you are having a conversation with people. And I think that's why, depending on the topic and depending on the students you have in your class, if you can get enthusiastic video uptake, it is really valuable for people to be able to watch one another's reactions or thinking faces or whether they're about to unmute. I also think all of the kind of work-life blurring that's happening right now is fraught with both old and new inequalities and disadvantages. And so, one of the community building things we can do is to just support our students by making sure that it's really clear that it's not going to count against them if they want to come and talk to us about challenges that they're facing or limitations that they have or ways that they'd prefer not to engage with the technology. In terms of some of the challenges I faced, I thought that community building would be something I could sense, and it was really hard to see it happening. So deep into the semester, I found out many of my students were connecting one-on-one, meeting for socially distant coffee. Some were in pods and having brunch with each other. And I had no idea. So there was some really, really positive connections that were happening that I didn't know about. And I think that that's something that is just worth keeping in mind, that we may not know how successful we are in using our kind of pedagogy and curriculum to help students build connections for peer learning. The other challenge I had was that some of my go-to strategies for community building I don't know that they totally failed. I would say that it was 50-50. So going back to Eddie's point that maybe even a 10% success rate is success, I really wanted small groups and breakout activities to be successful for everyone. And I found that it was hard to know when they'd been successful or not. And it was hard to know whether the quality was deteriorating over time or not. So I think that those are the two main challenges, is that there's a lot of good community building that you can't see. And then some of the go-to tools in my toolkit, like breakout groups, not only could I not see them in a way that wasn't disruptive to the group itself, but it was hard to know if it was successful for enough students that it was worth doing. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that some things are successful, but not for everyone. And that's part of why I had this sort of multi-tiered approach. So on to the concrete examples of what I did over the course of the semester. My friend Teddy, who's here as well, introduced me to a really basic app called Padlet. I don't have a paid account. I think I'm allowed to have 3 pads, but I'll share it in the chat. And Padlet was what I used for my introductions. You can upload a picture, you can write a small blurb about yourself, you can even upload a video, and it sits there as a sort of website only for those who have the link. And so I had students introduce themselves through Padlet, so we didn't take up time, but so that people could get to know one another. I also, as an introductory assignment, required students to submit an African song for a class playlist, a piece of African art that I incorporated into the beginning of each lecture, and inspirational quotes from African thought leaders. And so this was a way to put together a playlist that everyone could listen to throughout the semester, but it also gave me songs that I played at the start of the class, like before the time started. And then I invited the student who had selected that song to share what it meant to them. And then with the art, I talked about why I had picked that piece and invited the student who shared the art to talk about it. And so that was, I thought, a really gentle way to put the spotlight on the students, to amplify some of the course content, push them to kind of look into, cultural aspects of African politics, while also creating a bit of a kind of creative through line that had been created by the community. The biggest change that I made is that my group presentations were switched to a video format, and I had them upload them in advance. And so I had students still do a group assignment. I still let them sort of sign up for the topics they were most interested in. I tried roughly to allocate students according to time zones, with students all the way from San Francisco to Nairobi. So we had, I think, 11 or 12-hour time difference represented. And then I had them engage on the class discussion board on Canvas with the presentations before we came into the synchronous session. One of the things that I found really useful here is that I required students to put a comment on Canvas that included 2 things. It had to include applause and a question. So flipping the Q&A to an A and Q format. And that was really just to build in affirmations. I think that students need support being affirmative towards one another. And so it's something I always try to incorporate in my teaching. I also added a peer review element to the final project drafts. This was another way to kind of build community through all of the pieces of the course, and to ensure that students had support from one another, even if they didn't, reach out to people. And so this was required. It was according to topic and interest, to ensure that it was relevant for everyone. And I think that sort of worked. It's something that I'll probably look into in the future. And then other small things, I made a lot of things optional, but I made collaboration optional on the first and the last assignment. I made the entire first assignment optional based on a vote of the class. So I think ensuring that there's sort of dialogue and feedback between me and the students helped the students feel like I was being flexible and responsive to the needs of the community. And it also helped students see what one another's needs were so that they could kind of be mindful of the fact that this is a living and breathing classroom where we're trying to show up for one another's learning on a daily basis, but also through the structure of the course. And then the last thing that I did, which was in some ways the most kind of shiny and big C community building, was that I had what were called BLD, building community sessions. And it was breakfast, lunch, and dinner conversations where I invited guests and practitioners and experts to come to a special session outside of class and have a conversation with my students. And I'll say that, this was draining. I think like Eddie, I probably went overboard in making myself available, and I'm going to pare it back and slim it down, but I'm going to do a lot of what I did last semester, also this semester. And it's one of those things where it creates a holding vessel for students who really do want more time together to meet up. And that's something I've always had students ask for, even when we were in person. But I think for Zoom, I found that some of my students really were at everything, and they were always posting on Canvas, and they were incredibly enthusiastic, and the course was like their lifeline. For others, they could barely show up. They were, many, many time zones away, putting their toddler to bed, then attending all of their classes, and my class was last. And, they barely came through. But I think probably for both ends of the spectrum, knowing that the class was a vibrant community they could turn to was probably helpful in kind of ensuring that they stayed engaged throughout the semester. So I don't think it worked for everyone, but I do think, according to our variable metrics of success, it was great for me and great for a lot of the students.
Thank you, Zoe. I just want to pull out a couple of things that you said, that the focus on community at different levels and the opportunities for interacting one-on-one with you as a faculty member or with groups of students is something that it seems like a lot of faculty had surprising and good experiences with. Sometimes overwhelming, but kind of more vibrant office hours than they've ever experienced before in terms of students being there and having their names on their videos and all of that. But it was interesting how you pointed out the double-edgedness of the times when students are off on their own. It's really, anybody who's led breakout rooms has experienced that thing where you jump into a breakout room with students and all conversation ceases, or maybe it was never happening at all. It's so important to have them there on their own talking to each other, but it can be really hard to actually know, is it working or isn't it? And I also just loved your point about the affirmations. One thing I love in Zoom is how easy it is to establish a culture of having students use the chat or the reactions to be steadily affirming things or reacting to things as they go along in the class. So really a lot of great ideas there. So next we're going to hear from Madhvi. So Madhvi, take it away.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to share some of the things that we tried in our course at the med school. And so briefly, to give you a bit of context, the class that I'm talking about is a molecular biology course for first-year PhD students. We had 83 students. They came from multiple different graduate programs. So they had slightly different backgrounds in the biosciences, and they didn't all, many of them didn't know each other at all coming in. The class was team taught, so we had 6 faculty lecturers. So in addition to students being all over the place, we also were trying to maintain this cohesion between these multiple sections of the class. So each faculty member came in and taught like a module or two. And we adopted a flipped classroom model for the fall 2020 semester. So most of our content delivery was asynchronous. And then when we came together as a group, we had small group problem solving in breakout rooms, as well as some whole class review and discussion. So we were trying to balance having everyone together, as well as giving students time to work in groups of 6 or 7. And for the purposes of today, I'm going to focus more on the synchronous sessions because that's where most of the community building took place. So when we thought about community building, we really wanted to create connections to help facilitate participation. And one aspect of this for us was creating structures for people to share aspects of their identity. So I know Zoe also talked about doing introductions. We did them on Google Slides. And basically everyone in the classroom community, we were really intentional about making sure that the faculty and teaching fellows also participated. So everyone created a Google slide to introduce themselves. These could be prepared asynchronously, and then everyone shared them in their small groups on the second day of class. And just to give you an idea of what this looked like, here's the example of what I created. So included some identifying information optionally. People could include things about the pronunciation of their name. Students were including kind of their graduate program and year. The rest of us were including titles and things like that. Some of our research interests, things that we enjoy doing outside of work or school. And then we also asked people if they felt comfortable to include pictures. We gave everyone the freedom to kind of customize, and it was really incredible to see the range of things that students included. So we also invited everyone in the classroom community to be a DJ at the start of every class. So similar to Zoe's use of music, except we didn't have the nice content tie-in that she had. But basically whoever was interested could volunteer to come on 10 minutes before class, share the music that they had selected, gave people an incentive to log on a little bit early to see what the music was for that day. You know, people sometimes were commenting and responding in the chat, so it was really nice to see that type of engagement. It also avoided that sort of awkward silence that sometimes happens when everyone's joining a kind of large Zoom meeting. The other thing we did was pull questions to check in with the students to see how they're doing, to also ask them about aspects of their lives. We really wanted to, you know, promote having a balance. So we asked them things like, what are you doing over the weekend outside of studying and things like that, to help encourage them to have other things outside of what they were doing for this class. So this is our you know, poll question from the first day of class. We asked them how they were feeling about the semester. One, I guess, note about asking these type of questions about how they're doing is kind of have to be mentally prepared to deal with a number of students saying that they're not doing well or that they're anxious or overwhelmed, you know, particularly mid to late semester. And just, I think, trying to reassure them that this is a hard time, to validate what they've done in the class and encourage them to continue to keep going. And also to reassure them, as we mentioned, that, you know, if they need assistance or want support, that they should feel free to come to you, and that's not going to adversely affect them and their evaluation in the class. So another thing, you know, we really wanted to make sure that we were setting these community norms at the outset, kind of as Zoe mentioned, and we did this by co-creating shared community standards with the students. So we actually asked students on the first day of class in a poll kind of what they wanted in this learning community. And then we took those responses and consolidated them to come up with community standards that we shared back with the class. And we sort of asked if they had additional things to add. We made these available on our course website and really tried to hold each other accountable to these standards. So students really brought up great things that, you know, we also wanted for them. You know, they wanted it to be supportive and non-judgmental, wanted everyone to be able to participate, wanted to see diversity being valued, everyone being respectful. And so kind of using that as a basis, we wanted to provide different means for students to participate so that they could engage in the ways that felt most resonant with them. So we were very intentional with them about rewarding a variety of different types of participation, whether it was, answering questions or asking questions, taking notes during discussion. So in our breakout groups, we used Google Docs to kind of help get a sense of what our students were discussing in their groups, and students could take notes during that time. So I think really allowing them to participate as they felt comfortable in the small and large group discussions. And part of that was also opportunities to anonymously ask questions and provide feedback. So some of that anonymous question asking was through embedded forms that we had in our asynchronous videos. And then we also kind of had really brief sort of anonymous surveys where they could give us feedback, and then we would address that feedback in the class and try to adapt accordingly. And I think, as was previously mentioned, having that sort of sense of trust and showing students that we were responding to what they were saying was really important, that they felt like it was a dialogue as much as possible instead of it just being us kind of one-sidedly giving them information. And we also used Slack to facilitate communication, to give students another way to engage with each other and engage with the teaching team. So we were actually very impressed with how much uptake there was. We had the sort of public channels for the teaching team to communicate with the students and send out announcements or answer larger questions. We also had private channels where the small groups could talk to each other. And this also provided an easy way for students to contact each other without having to share contact information through direct messaging. And we were really happy to see that, a large number of the over 5,000 messages that we had sent in our class were direct messages. The students were really talking to each other or feeling free to reach out to our teaching fellows. And another aspect that we incorporated was sharing career insights. So we felt that this was really important to help, faculty or students get to know faculty a little bit better, and also to kind of help normalize some challenges in the process of training. So one of the ways we did this was we interviewed faculty when each of them began teaching their section, and we asked them all how the pandemic was impacting them, kind of to share strengths in a high point and a low point of their graduate school experience. And also, if they could talk to their younger self who was just starting graduate school, what would they tell themselves? So we found that this was, a nice opportunity for faculty to share, challenges that they had in the past navigating graduate school, as well as kind of what they were navigating in the current moment, and a way for them to offer advice and lessons that they have learned to the students. And we heard from students that, this humanized faculty, because they were sharing their experiences, it made students more comfortable in approaching or interacting with the faculty. So we were very excited to hear that. And we also hope that this, normalized challenges, especially during this very difficult time, to reduce students, feelings of isolation and anxiety. And we had faculty sharing a wide variety of experiences. So we were able to leverage the teaching team. They were sharing everything from failing a graduate school qualifying exam, coming here as an international student, dealing with experimental struggles. So I think there was a lot for different students to resonate with. And we kind of expanded on that by inviting guests from academia and industry a few times in the semester to come in and share their experiences and advice. And this was really an advantage that we felt the online platform afforded us because we weren't limited in who we could invite. And when we asked students at the end of the semester, 98% of them said these were valuable for thinking about how they would navigate a career in science. So we were excited to hear that. Just briefly, we also asked students at the end of the semester how valuable these different strategies were in helping them feel connected with members of the classroom community, whether that was each other or members of the teaching team. Two things really stood out to us, the faculty interviews and the small group discussions. But I think what was important is that, different things worked for different people. So as Zoe mentioned, it was really important for us to use a variety of strategies. So to kind of quickly summarize, hopefully this sort of consistent approach increases students' comfort in interacting with others in the learning community. It does take a little bit of time, but not too much. We didn't spend, most classes, it was only 5 minutes. With the interview, sometimes it was a little bit longer. I think most of the things we did can be implemented even in larger classes. We did it with 80 students, but I think they scale quite well. As I mentioned, it was important to us to use a variety of strategies so that different students could connect in ways that were authentic and meaningful to them. And that we felt it was really important to integrate it in courses to show that faculty value students' whole selves, aspects of identity and experiences outside of the content. And that embedding it in courses kind of allowed us to reach students who may not come to optional things, especially when they were already, many of them were already sort of overwhelmed by the format and everything else going on. So briefly, I just want to acknowledge that this was only possible with a lot of people, our course director, Joe Loparo, and a great team of teaching faculty and teaching fellows.
Thank you, Madhvi. I feel like there's one of the themes that's really emerging through the 3 faculty we've heard from so far is how different things are going to be needed for different students, maybe more so than ever in the present context. Something that was also striking was just how much you focused on actually encouraging students to bring their personal lives into the classroom, which is something I know a lot of faculty had some trepidation about. And it seems like the thoughtfulness with which you did that allowed that to be an experience that didn't feel like it was invasive to students. And that sounds excellent. So next we'd like to go to Dr. V.
Good morning. Hopefully, I brought some photos for you all. Christina Villarreal. I like to go by V or Dr. V, and I teach the Ethnic Studies and Education course. And I was terrified coming into this semester, especially after this summer, because it's a course that really historicizes white supremacy, racial trauma, settler colonialism in the context of schools and how it affects young people and us, as well as exploring avenues of resistance, healing, and liberation. You can't teach a class like that without intimacy, without willingness to be vulnerable, to have those conversations. And I had never done it online. So I have to name that piece. So what I've been sharing in terms of building community is actually my own standpoint and where I had to come in, which was allowing myself to really be vulnerable, which is terrifying. It always is. But I teach teachers, and I always tell them, we can't ask our students to do anything that we're not willing to do ourselves. And I think a huge element of surrender, which I think so many of us are struggling with right now in the context of the double pandemic that we're all navigating. So it's a course, typically, maybe it was like 60 students in person where I'd have 3 TFs. And I knew that wasn't going to work because the intimacy piece, how many squares can fit on a screen? And so the intentional piece just around holding smaller communities. And so In terms of what I already learned challenges, I did teach 4 live 2-hour synchronous sessions every week. I wouldn't recommend that. But I want to also name that for those of us, in terms of also thinking about who our teaching teams are, and I've heard my colleagues also just name, right, and the gratitude towards the teams, that because none of this can be done in isolation. All of my teaching fellows are alumni of the course. So they've been through that journey. And so I'm intentional about that. And I really prioritize folks that have teaching experience, especially with young people, and that engage in a relational pedagogy, which is different than technical pedagogy, right? Technical really focuses on what we need to know, what we need to do. Important, but focused on that alone is insufficient. And relational pedagogy, which focuses on who we are, and willingness to allow that humanity to show up in the classroom. So I'd have to start with naming that piece first. And I'm going to just take you through some of the activities that we did. And then, because I know we want to be able to get to questions. But I started, and I would tell them the same thing. Here is my teaching team. There they are. I love them so very, very, very much. And it was things like when we would film our videos for the class, we would coordinate our outfits. And this was a bi-coastal teaching team. It's sometimes those small things that even I didn't plan to share that. But as I look at this now, it was those small details that the students absolutely noticed. So I start all my classes. I always said that I start the same way that I would start my 7th grade classes. I taught middle school for several years in Oakland, California, where I'm from, by writing acrostic poems. Previously, we had done it in person. And I had to think about what would that look like online. And I learned a lot from one of my homies is on the call, Josh Bookin in the Teaching Learning Lab, in terms of also when we ask students to prepare things, just giving them that time and asking them to prepare their acrostic poems this year digitally. And so Madhvi, when you were sharing your slide, your introduction slide, that really resonated. And letting them know, right, that they would be expected to share it more extensively in a small breakout room, and that every person would get exactly a minute, 60 seconds to then share it with the class. And I did this because I wanted to hear every single voice. And I wanted to let them know that every single voice matters on day one. But I also began by making sure me and the teaching team, we shared who we were first, letting them know kind of who I am. They get to know a little bit about my background, my likes, my dislikes, what matters to me. And I'll show you how then this led to a more generative process in terms of the way the community itself was co-constructed with my students. So I want to note that I shared with them, right, that I love to bake. You see the cookies on here, and Canela, my little dog, she is right there, always by my side, and that I love food and never too far away from a bowl of pho. And so I think it just, in terms of setting that tone, you got to see just some of their acrostic poems, bringing in I told them they didn't have they could draw it as long as it could fit on a slide, or they can make it digitally. So just allowing for different ways. And there's no wrong way to do it. It's how do you want to introduce yourself to all of us? And in terms of thinking, how can we make this, feel like our classroom? The TAs each created a digital mural of all the acrostic poems that lived on the homepage of our Canvas. So that was just one way that I kept in terms of tying us together. So that was just one thing in terms of, I think, setting the tone of just allowing, right, every person to just introduce themselves as they chose to. Similarly, I've heard music as another theme. We began every single class with what we call the Ethnic Studies Mixtape. And so when they would sign on to Zoom, there was always a song playing with a prompt asking them to drop right in the chat that was related to that week's, the themes, the topics that we were exploring. So just very intentional in terms of what music we were choosing and how it would relate to the course themes. And so there was a lot of, I think, the deep, heavy stuff that we got into in class, I'm happy to talk about any of those. But what really stood out to the students were the times that we spent outside of class that they came up with. They knew that I loved to bake. They had heard from the TAs that I used to bake for the students because snack time during break was actually really, it was an important community building, right, tool when we were in person. How do you do that online with 120 students across 4 sections? So the students asked, they're like, when are we going to bake with you? I was like, wow, I've never done, I've always wanted to bake with students, but I've never had a chance to do that. I think I skipped over something too. Early on, we also sent postcards. I brought an example. And the postcards are actually done by an artist that I went to college with. That's Melanie Cervantes. I encourage you to look up her and her partner, Jesus Art. We were at Berkeley together, so I got to kind of share that story about ethnic studies. It's just a little something, again, I think to keep that connection and in-person element. We would take screenshots a lot and include those in email. So when they did get their postcards, we would take class photos and include that in the weekly emails that the TFs were in charge of sending. And then here is the baking that I was setting up. And again, it was their idea, and then we just kind of went with it. And because Canela had become part of the class, similar to what other folks have said, I invited them to bring and have their families. Families were oftentimes very present in class, children, pets, grandparents. I wanted that tone set from the very beginning, because this is a course so rooted in community. So we sent out the ingredients, told them, leave the butter out on the counter, do not microwave it. And I never tried it before, but we spent a Friday night baking together. And I want to be clear, right? This is something that just came naturally to me. The reason why I was down to do it was because, well, I'd be baking on a Friday night with a glass of wine anyway. So why not just have my computer and my students there, and let's see what happens. And it was, I would say, it was a very healing experience for me to get to do this. We were figuring it out as we went along. The community, I think they really came together. The TAs, they're taking screenshots of the students, highlighting what they were making. The students came up with the idea for a dance break. One of the students, who is a DJ, he's an administrator at a high school, so he does that for his kids, and so he did that for us. So things that we didn't necessarily plan for. So that was one of the things that we did. And then from there, one of the students, Kathy, you see her right there. I think just in seeing that and knowing that I love noodles and pho, she said, my mom can teach us all how to make pho. And so we had an unforgettable Sunday. Right, the Snickerdoodles was in October, November. We came together on a Sunday, and this is Mama Tran, who you see right here. And we cooked pho together. And what was really, I think, really powerful about this experience, again, I never did anything like this before, was as she was cooking with us, storytelling, central to critical race theory, central to ethnic studies. She began to tell us her story and about her journey from Vietnam to the United States as a refugee, sharing about her husband, right, who had been imprisoned. And I think as we all were listening to her story, including her daughter, we just began to contextualize our own experiences so much more. Again, unplanned, and it happened very organically. I think especially as she shared her dreams for her daughter, one of which, right, is her daughter being here. So that was another thing that we did. I had brought a short video for her, but I know that we're almost at time, but I wanted you to be able to hear from her. I mean, what this turned into was at our final slideshow, because everyone knew Mama Tran, and not every single person participated. I'd say for the Snickerdoodle night, maybe about 20, 25 of the 120 came, and then a different 20, 25 came to cook the pho. She, she shared messages with us. So she was a huge part of our community. So I think in terms of what I learned, I think the same things that I learned from my 7th graders, I've talked about this a lot, that those lunchtime conversations that I would have with my kids, when I taught 7th grade, when I teach 120 7th graders, 4 periods a day, 5 days a week, that those moments, the informal ones, the time I spent in living rooms with their families, deeply enhanced the intensity with which and the rigor with which we could approach the topics in the actual classroom, like the intellectual topics, and that you can't shortchange getting to know them. I would always tell them how I introduce acrostic poems is, I can't teach you until I know you, and you can't learn from me until you know me. And so I think that is, very central to my pedagogical core as an educator. Again, something that I had learned from the young people that I worked with that I continue to carry into classrooms here at HGSE. So thanks for looking at it.
Thank you so much. That was just, amazing. And you can just see in the chat how we could all just feel how exciting your class must have been, and would love to be there. And it's really wonderful to see how you took the opportunity, the somewhat scary opportunity, but the opportunity to suddenly we're teaching people while they're in the context of their homes, and to actually really bring that into the classroom and make something of it. I absolutely love it. So we have about 10 minutes or so to have some Q&A. There's, I think, a variety of things that are in the chat or other questions that you may be having. So feel free to put up your hand if you have a question to ask of our panelists. And let me just also put out there a little activity for all of us that will go on during the Q&A, which is in the chat. I would like to ask people to share if there's something you saw today that you think you might incorporate or remix for your own teaching. Just let us know what that is, or if there's something that you would like to share with others that has been really great in your teaching for building community. Feel free to just put those in the chat so that we can get a running sense of it. So I'd like to use the raise hand feature for the questions. And for those of you who have updated your Zoom, that will now be under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you who haven't updated your Zoom, it will be in the participants panel. Okay, I see Peter.
I had a question about the previous presentation and those little cards about the identities and the personalities of individual students. I think that was a wonderful idea. I was wondering where those got posted. Did that just go onto the Canvas website, and were people comfortable having a sort of gallery there? Were they easily accessible to others?
Yeah, the Google slide deck, we posted it on the Canvas site as well. And yeah, because people were free to share what they felt comfortable sharing with the class, they were fine with having it shared with everyone in the class, and people being able to go back to that to see who they were at later points in the class.
So those who weren't comfortable having pictures of themselves, obviously, just use text or other photos and things. So you got around it that way.
I mean, some of them put photos of things they were interested in, or they chose not to put a photo based on their comfort level.
So I'm looking for raised hands, but in the absence of one right now, I'd like to throw a question out, as it's come up across all the speakers, this problem of it being potentially a little too much in terms of what you're taking on as a teacher with the other types of activities or extra sessions for time zones. So as you prune back, how are you thinking about, how do you adjust to make this sustainable for you and your course teams? And if any of you have want to jump in, feel free, because I think this is relevant to all four of you.
I'm in this lucky situation where my spring course is a graduate course, which is expected to be much smaller. And so the hope would be that if this were to all continue, that I would sort of build up to be able to do more in fall. But I think I'm not a natural planner, and that was sort of, I intentionally left the class somewhat open this fall so that we could move towards something that worked better. And I was like helped by students to a greater realization of, some students love that, but overall, I would say they wanted less. They were happier with less sort of aggressive presence as long as it was scheduled.
Yes, clarity is such a big thing and such a hard thing to get to do when you're also trying to experiment and you're doing things you've never done before. And I think V's thing of coming right out and letting them know your vulnerability up front can give you a little bit of more wiggle room as you try to get that sorted out. So I'd like to pull Sarah's question out of the chat here. She's asking about, with all the tech tools, how much support did you need to provide students? And I want to just actually even broaden that a little bit to just hear from you all about what supports you used. One of the things that was really notable was the way that the teaching and learning centers and all of the staff and academic technology staff really, were very present and eager to help. And I just want to say thank you to all of our staff for all of the work that you all put in to make things go well in this term. And I'd love to hear from our panelists. Where did you find the support you needed? And where did your teaching fellows find the support you needed this term? How did you manage that?
I'll answer this one really quickly. Ian Tosh is our teaching tech specialist at the Kennedy School, and he's totally fabulous and approachable and makes things really easy and provides an abundance of information. And I just want to offer, in the spirit of vulnerability, as Dr. V suggested, that the thing that I needed help with was the thing I didn't know I needed help with. And so no matter how much preparing we do, I think it's really important, like some have said in the chat and some have said in the comments today, to try to streamline the number of devices or platforms that we use. I, as I mentioned, had a total Wi-Fi failure for half the semester that was really stressful, and I had to call in on my phone while having, the slides progress. And I think that our students appreciate that sort of candor and flexibility and vulnerability. The thing that I didn't know I needed help with was that I thought my lectures weren't being posted unless I approved them. And I found out there was another tab on Canvas that was automatically uploading all of the bloopers and all of the failed pre-recording attempts and all of the conversations that I accidentally launched from inside of my Harvard Zoom. And I thought they were personal. And I discovered this at the end of the semester. I have no idea how many people saw that for 24 to 48 hours. I was totally devastated and mortified. I had lived the worst nightmare that everybody had when we had to switch to digital. And I'm still here and I think it's fine. And my beloved colleague, Ian Tosh, helped me shut it down. I shut it down. No student ever told me and I'm not untoward. So luckily I don't put things in front of the camera that I wouldn't want on the front page of the New York Times. But it's just to say that there is a lot of support. I think more than anything, especially with Zoom constantly updating and changing its, tools and that sort of thing, everyone should try to work within their comfort zone because that is the best place for students to connect with us. And so I'm all for experimentation and flexibility, but I also think that us having our confidence to connect with people is the single most important thing. 99% of our success hinges just on us being able to show up and find our students when we need to.
Thank you, Zoe. So I saw just before this last moment, somebody, I think it was Amber, perhaps raising a hand in front of the camera. I don't know if that was intentional or accidental, but I just want to invite Amber or anybody else who's trying to get the attention without raising their hand to feel free to jump in for one last question. But I'm going to give Amber the shot right now because she's the one I saw.
Oh, my apologies. I was just clapping for Dr. Zoe getting through that moment. So more clapping to her.
More clapping. Well, that's probably
Thanks, everyone.
A good opportunity here for us to clap actually for our entire panel. So I really just want to thank all of you, and also especially large thanks to Kerry and Patrice, who did the work of putting all of this together and conceiving of this panel. And thank you to the Vice Provost's Office for Advances in Learning for having this idea of bringing us all together to learn from each other. So let's all give a virtual round of applause to our panelists and organizers. And I'd now like to hand it off to Patrice, who is going to do a little wrap up and give us next steps in our last 5 minutes here.
Sure, thanks. So first, I would like to thank all of our panelists and participants for joining us today. It was great to hear from everybody and learn together. And I just wanted to highlight a few things as we wrap up. We did put together a Google site with a list of resources, and Kerry will be sharing the link to that in the chat. And we'll also go through some of the resources that were shared during the chat today and make sure that we add those to the site as well. And early in the conversation, there was a discussion about Remo, Congregate, and Zoom. And Jonathan did share the graphic that shows the comparison of those 3 tools, and we've added that resource to the site. And as we wrap up, I'd like to reiterate something that Becca said, in that just to be grateful for all the staff who worked tirelessly over the last 9 or so months in supporting these efforts. And I know several people on my team are on this meeting as well. And so I would just like to shout out and thank them and say how grateful I am to have them on my team. And that also serves as a reminder, a lot of work went into the designs and ideas and things that people shared. And we encourage you to reach out to your teaching and learning center, learning designers, learning technologists. We are here to support you, and we have a number of resources at the ready to help guide you through selecting tools, thinking about activities, as well as student-facing directions. And the other thing that we can help you with is, especially as you're thinking about technology, a lot of different tools have been mentioned. And if I put my IT hat on for a minute to just say different tools are available at different schools, and to be sure to check with your learning technologist or IT to see what tools are available to you at your tool, and to make sure you understand things like how they handle student data and privacy. Has it been reviewed for security? And has it been reviewed for accessibility and doesn't meet the current accessibility requirements. And so with that, I would like to thank everyone again for joining us today.
Thank you all.